From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. Today we're talking to a gentleman who left a lucrative corporate career in New York City to move his family to New Mexico and start farming. That's right after these brief announcements. This program is sponsored by Shine, a pet food company that features over 40 organic, fresh dog and cat food recipes that give your animals delicious and balanced meals. Shine uses responsibly sourced ingredients and earth-friendly packaging, and they're a certified B Corporation, which means that they meet the highest social and environmental standards. My own dogs eat Shine pet food, and they love it, even my very finicky dog, Curly. Shine has stores in Santa Fe, Boulder, and Denver, and you can order online from anywhere at shine.pet. This program is sponsored by the Agrarian Trust. Agrarian Trust is charting a new path forward for the land trust movement. They're advancing an innovative and robust model of land ownership in which agrarianism, social and environmental justice, community well-being, and the earth itself are all seen as fundamentally intertwined. They're doing this by helping regenerative farmers and ranchers to secure long-term, affordable leases. That helps to strengthen local food systems and to transform community relationships to the land across the country. Visit agrariantrust.org to learn more. This program is sponsored by the Greenhorns. Listeners to Down to Earth might enjoy the newly released 6th edition of the New Farmer's Almanac, a literary miscellany written by and for working agrarians. This year's volume is titled Adjustments and Accommodations, and it's full of essays, poetry, and images that explore how people are facing challenges and uncertainties on the land. Learn more and order your copy at greenhorns.org. I'm very happy now to welcome Lorenzo Dominguez. He is co-owner of Hacienda Dominguez and Chelenzo Farms here in Cerrillos, New Mexico, where we're recording this. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Thank you very much, Mary Charlotte. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you have such an interesting story. You came from New York City where you had a career not at all in farming, a kind of corporate career, and you decided to kind of up and leave. First of all, how did you choose New Mexico?
Yeah, that's a great question. We came around the West Coast. We initially were looking at property in Northern California. This was back in 2021. Actually, it was 2020 when we decided to move from New York. I had been there 30 years. My wife had been there 20 years. She's originally from Michigan, and I'm originally from Northern California. Pandemic hit. She's a physician. She was on the front line, and she had COVID very bad. This is a time when 85% of the people weren't coming out of the hospitals. They were being intubated. So it was a very scary moment for us, but it was also the last straw. We knew that we wanted a more natural, connected to the land, connected to a natural way of living lifestyle. So that prompted us to start looking at where we were going to move to. And as I mentioned before, Northern California was the initial place. Top 10 out of 12 places were going to be in Northern California, but then the forest fires hit. And air quality was the number one factor on our list. And so completely ruled out moving to Northern California. We looked at Colorado for a moment. It was still too cold. We were trying to escape the cold of the Northeast. And also cultural diversity is very important to me. I'm a Mexican American. I'm very proud of my heritage. And I just didn't feel it was as diverse as I wanted it to be. So then we looked at Santa Fe, and in a way it was the great compromise, but it was actually ultimately the perfect choice for multiple reasons.
Were you thinking agriculture the whole time?
Well, initially we were thinking a small homestead. My wife grew up in rural or semi-rural Michigan. They raised wolves. They had horses. They had a pig.
They raised wolves?
They raised wolves, yeah. And so she liked to call it a semi-farm. My father-in-law, who happens to live down the dirt road now, says, no, it wasn't really a farm, but it was a semi-rural lifestyle. And so she had this idyllic memory of this childhood, and she wanted a farm. And you and I have talked a lot about the fact that my wife and I have focused on longevity practices for a while. And one of the main things out of the Blue Zone study that we've talked about, which was, it was a look at 5 communities around the world that had the highest concentration of centenarians. One of the principles that came out of that was continual learning, right? And so when she says, let's have a farm, I knew that was going to be a steep learning curve, and I embraced it. And so, as you mentioned, I lived most of my life in suburban areas, whether it was California, New York. I worked for a corporation. The last place was Peekskill, New York, which is about 50 miles north of New York City. This would be a completely new adventure, especially since now we live essentially off the grid. All our neighbors off the grid. We're the only house tied to the grid on this mesa here. We have a septic system. We have catchment systems. I mean, all of this is very new to us, but it's been very exciting, embracing that idea of continual learning. So as you said, had no farming experience, but every moment of every day here has been really exciting, learning all we're doing. But I have to say, not only have we been able to hit the ground running because of our own motivation, but because we knew that community and partners were essential to making all of this happen. So we have worked with the Quivira Coalition as well as dozens of other organizations to do the ecological restoration work, the regenerative farming work that we do here, as well as the community work that we've been doing. So a lot of credit goes out to all the partners, our community here in Cerrillos, and all the volunteers who've had our workshops in order to do all the work that we've accomplished here.
Tell us about the land. You bought a few properties that were adjacent to each other and they border BLM land. Mm-hmm. What was the land like when you arrived? How was it being used? And what were the first kind of changes that you decided to make?
Yeah, I think the best way to describe the land, it's high mountain desert. Here in Santa Fe, we're at 6,000 feet. We have a lot of rolling hills. There's about 15% vegetation cover that's been assessed by the NRCS because we had a few projects we did. One was the Healthy Soil Program grant. We also got a Western SARE grant recently. So we had to have an intimate understanding of what the land was like. So if the listener can imagine, once again, a desert landscape with sandy, loamy clay, lots of juniper trees, an occasional pinon, some tufts of native grasses, and cactus and cholla. That's essentially what the land looks like. So it's inherently its own sort of beauty, but we also had this vision of regreening the desert. We've been inspired by a number of other people who have led the way, such as Gary Nabhan, that's done a lot of work, and I know you've interviewed him, and I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with him, especially in conjunction with the Agave Heritage Festival in Tucson. So basically, we saw this land and embraced it for what it was, and hoping to restore the ecosystem in one way or another.
Now, restoring it to what?
Yeah, so I think at the ground level, please excuse the pun, is that we have to restore the health of the soil, right? In order to do that, there are a number of principles, whether it's keeping a ground cover so that the moisture is retained, not tilling or disturbing the root structures, encouraging or supporting biodiversity, both in terms of plants and wildlife, and then a number of techniques that support that so that you cultivate basically more fungal and bacterial communities that support the plants themselves. So a lot of what supports, this regreening effort is not visible, because it's in the ground. I mean, there's been a lot of knowledge that's come to the forefront in the last 10 years about the fungal communities that support forests and agriculture in general, which is basically led to a lot of motivation in terms of the regenerative agriculture movement. So I don't know if that answers your question more or less.
Well, I mean, there's so much conversation about when you talk about restoration, restoring to an ideal historical point so many centuries ago, undoing damage that was done in the last 50 years, like those kind of questions.
No, and that's a great point. I also, to come full circle on the original question, what did the land look like when we got here? My understanding has been, based on a lot of the history that I've read about the area, is that this used to be primarily grass and prairie land. And then you had a lot of the cattle ranchers during the 1800s that came through the Southwest that weren't aware that they were leaving the land fallow, right? And that's when all the junipers encroached on the land, and you had the desertification of the land itself. So ideally, at some point, we want to find a middle ground between encouraging more native grasses and having more prairie land, as well as encouraging that biodiversity. And that means, perhaps trimming the junipers, not necessarily eliminating them all, and integrating them into more biodiversity within the land.
So when you got here, somebody who is a specialist in the ecology of this area advised you to kind of lay low and observe for a year. But being, as you were telling me before, being New Yorkers is like, no, we don't sit still.
Right.
What were the first things you did?
Yeah, and supporting that thought. Not only is that applied to agriculture, but it's applied to the culture, the lifestyle here. Here in New Mexico, it's known as the land of enchantment, but jokingly, you probably heard this, is also known as the land of mañana. So that when it comes to integrating service people or contracting people, sometimes it takes a while to get people here, because the priority is not necessarily working for productive reasons as the culture in New York, or even a lot of the United States, which focuses on the individual and production. But the culture here is similar to how I grew up in terms of my Hispanic Latino culture of the community is important, lifestyle is important, spending time with your family is important. So things have a much slower pace all around, not just in terms of agriculture, but in the way things are done around here. Building relationships. I don't think I've ever been as close to my community ever in my whole life than I've been here in Cerrillos.
In the last 2 years.
Yes. I know all of our neighbors, and you and I have joked about this, basically you encounter somebody on the road, it's another 15-minute conversation before you get off to where you're going.
Yes, we call this the New Mexico conference call. You both roll down your windows.
Yeah. And that happens a lot. So you quickly learn things go at a different pace around here. And as per your question, we didn't necessarily heed the advice to wait a year because we wanted to start doing things, but we hit the ground running. And as I mentioned before, I think we've made a lot of progress simply because I relied on other people, and their decades of experience and their trial and error and their mistakes. We listen very carefully and also listen to different opinions. I mean, every step of the way, there have been more than one perspective on how to do things, whether it's planting or livestock or otherwise.
So what are some of the projects that you have going on here at the Hacienda?
Yeah, we have multiple different projects, everything from livestock, which we have meat birds and egg layers. We also have goats, so we're milking goats, and we're going to start herd share in August. We also have lots of conservation projects. Everything from we're trying an innovative catchment system off our 33-foot grow dome that we built in October of last year, where we have a gutter system that goes into a 2,500-gallon catchment tank that will supply the water for everything we're doing in the grow dome itself. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, two major projects. One was the Healthy Soil Program grant, where we created water harvesting earthworks along with terraces where we put cover crops to help restore the health of that soil. We're starting on a new project funded by the Western SARE grant where we're building a permaculture food forest. We'll integrate 6 different types of succulents along with 4 other types of native plants. And we're also building a pond there to have all different levels of essentially a forest, and to build that biodiversity and restore the health of the soil. We're also integrating art. Art is very important. We just had a art launch about 2 weeks ago where we created 2 murals. There are 12 by 26 feet that are on the side of our garage now, and they depict 2 Aztec gods along with endangered species. We work with the Endangered Species Coalition, Lobos of the Southwest, Bat Conservation International, as well as the Wild Earth Guardians to support the project. And the artist came in from Mexico. Her artist name is Hoxine, and basically depicted 2 Aztec gods along with the long-nosed Mexican bat, the Mexican wolf, and the Mexican spotted owl, to celebrate the Endangered Species Act, or the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. So that's a taste of all the projects we have, but there are lots of different small conservation things that we're doing around the hacienda and the farm as well.
It's interesting, and it's a little off the subject of agriculture, but I thought the part of the purpose of the mural project is to really shine a light on the presence of Mexican culture here in New Mexico.
Yes.
And the
absolutely.
whole question of what is Mexican and what is New Mexican is it's a longer conversation than we can have here, but it's interesting. It's just interesting to think about that.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you pointed it out. Another initiative that I've undertaken personally is I'm a fellow in the Culture of Health for Racial Equity Institute, which is supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And basically that fellowship is to focus on racial inequity issues in my community. As you mentioned, when I did the application for that, I started by saying, well, in the next 2 minutes, I'm going to unpack 500 years of history, which is virtually impossible, but it's alluding to what you just said. It's a much longer conversation. Mexicans in particular, and Mexican Americans, have made many, many contributions in this area. We see it all around us in terms of the cuisine, the music, the traditions, and the agriculture. So part of what we're trying to do is raise the profile of that history and heritage.
You're listening to Down to Earth. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
We're in a new chapter of conservation. In the first chapter of conservation in this country, you had wilderness and then you had city. But today, more and more, we understand that there's this very important piece in the middle that we call the working landscape.
That is Leslie Allison, the Executive Director of the Western Landowners Alliance.
These are the places that provide our food, our fiber. They provide the jobs that sustain the rural communities. These things are incredibly important, and they're disappearing. And that's really our next challenge going forward. We have to think beyond protected wilderness. And you can't do that unless you're engaging the people in those landscapes, first and foremost in that solution.
Led by the people on the ground, Western Landowners Alliance advances policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species.
What we're seeing in the West today is incredibly hopeful because you do see collaborations, working with partners, trying to realize this vision that's so important to us. I think many places in the rural West are actually leading the way on this.
And so can you. Join us and learn more at westernlandowners.org.
And now back to our program. So tell us about the food crops that you're growing.
Yeah, we have both market garden as well as the drought resistant crops, which are the succulents, which is more, and we talked about slowing things down. So succulents, and agave in particular, is also known as slow agriculture, because agave, for example, takes 7 to 35 years to mature before it can be harvested if you're doing it for distillates such as tequila or mezcal. You could also use the leaves or the pencas of the agave. We plan to use that for fermented livestock feed at some point, so you can cut those along the way of their growth. And then the market gardens, we have 10 raised beds as well as all the vegetation that we're growing in our grow dome. And that's primarily to serve our community-supported agriculture, or CSA farm share, within our immediate vicinity, as well as selling at the greengrocer in Madrid. We've signed up and have qualified for the Santa Fe farmers markets. We'd love to go to Del Sur this summer, which is located on the south side of Santa Fe. However, as with all farmers in New Mexico, it's a matter of supply and demand. We're not sure we can supply enough to actually have a day where we're providing, enough to sell at the market. So they're trying to strike a balance between all that we produce and being able to share it with the community.
And you are feeding your family with the food you have here?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. It's integral to why we're here and our philosophy. My wife is a physician, so focusing on our health has been very important. And we know that organic vegetables and plants that we grow ourselves are really important to cultivating that within our home and our family.
Where are you getting the water that you're using for irrigation? I mean, you're doing some dryland farming and then some irrigated agriculture.
Yeah, no, great question. So we rely on our wells for one part, but we also increasingly rely on catchment. So we have here on the top or the mesa part of our establishment, we have two 1,500-gallon catchment tanks that we use for our live-in farm interns facility. We also have a 2,500-gallon cistern that I mentioned that we're using for the dome. And the two first tanks worked really well because they're based behind a 2,000 square foot garage where we get a lot of rainfall and a lot of snow melt. So they fill up immediately and provide probably 85% of our needs in terms of what we use in the garage, as well as for our animals as well. So catchment and the well and then also just all the conservation techniques we're using. I mentioned the water harvesting earthworks that we implement, which are basically small one-rock dams to zuni bowls to something called zanja y bordo, which agave farmers use down in Mexico. So we're doing our best and then mulch is another thing. We both wood mulch, we have rock mulch that we use on the plants. Everything we can do to conserve water. And the last thing I want to mention, because I've mentioned so many times, is the succulents themselves. They have evolved to be conservative plants. And one of the reasons we're trying to introduce here and pioneer this here in northern New Mexico, because they will help with drought-resistant crops. As people learn more about how they can be used. Even cactus is a great example, how most people almost think they're, for lack of a better word, not pests, but weeds, or not something they necessarily want because of their thorns. But Mexican culture eats two parts of the cactus. One is the nopal or the pad. We use as a vegetable. You can have it with your huevos rancheros in the morning. But also the tunas. The tunas are the cactus pear, which are, if you've never tried before, you have to try it. It's probably my favorite fruit. And as a small anecdote to support that, when women are pregnant, they often take a liking to a particular food. My mom has long told the story of how I was the first of her children, and she said her craving was for the tuna. So I don't know if that somehow was integrated in my personal pensions, but it's definitely one of my favorite fruits. So I think there's a lot of value in these succulents that people are not aware of. And as you probably through your interviews know, there is a not only regenerative agriculture, but there is a movement to understanding indigenous practices overall. And so people are getting a better understanding of how what we commonly see as weeds actually have many different medicinal and nutritional properties as well. So
what are some of the indigenous practices that you are integrating onto the farm here?
The water harvesting earthworks is probably the foremost one, which basically we're building, structures on the land that allow us to preserve the water and to be able to feed or to water the production of crops.
And these are, very, very low-tech structures. We're talking about moving sort of small and medium-sized stones and putting them in lines and things like that. Correct. To slow and spread the water.
That's correct. So we're doing that. So, and also building little, I had mentioned Zuni bowls. So basically it's, for lack of a better word, a cup or a little dam, a circular cup within the land, and you line that with water in order to retain that water. And sometimes you plant around that in order so that the roots tap into that pool of water itself. One of the things that we do is that we trim the branches of our juniper trees here as a compromise, because there are those that believe, especially cattle ranchers, and I know there are a number of U.S. governmental agencies that work with them to clear swaths of 10,000s of acres throughout the Southwest in order to restore the prairie lands. But
clear them of juniper.
Right, completely clear them of juniper in order to restore the native grasses. However, there are ecologists and environmentalists that don't agree with that and that feel that the junipers are a natural part of the landscape, right? So what we've done is we've compromised, and this was partly inspired by the indigenous practice. A lot of the Native Americans here would trim the junipers in order for them, because they often grow out into what look like bushes, quite frankly, and to trim them so that they grew vertically, so that they have longer branches that they use for their building structures. So we're doing the same, except we take our branches and we place them on the land in order to create alluvial fans, so that when the precipitation hits the land, the water spreads rather than creating more gullies or arroyos. And so we found immediately in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of good results from that. So we're seeing more grasses, more vegetation. It's going to be a slow process, especially since we're in a 23-year-old drought, and we're hoping over the long run it works.
Talk about the people part of what you're doing here. I mean, you, when you arrived, basically reached out to all your neighbors and so many organizations, and you have perhaps rotating, but a workforce of people, workers, interns who are coming to the farm.
Yeah. As I mentioned before, we couldn't have done it without everybody outside our immediate family that's helped, been gracious and enough to come and help us, whether it's at workshops or sharing their knowledge or the programs such as the Farmers Ranchers Planning Program that Quivira has. We've been very lucky in that regard. And it's also, as you mentioned or asked about the indigenous practices, it's part of an indigenous philosophy I've learned as well, which I knew about, but really have learned more about, is it takes a village. It's a cliche that we, especially liberal-minded people, like to use a lot, but it's really, really important, and we're living it here. It does take a village. Whether it's to raise your children or to grow crops. In terms of my study for what we're doing in terms of the succulent and agave planting, there is a great book. I believe it's called Good Farmers, and it's a study of indigenous practice done south of the border in Latin America. And the book points out that a lot of the earthwork projects of building terraces are done over decades, if not centuries, right? They've been done throughout the world. So it's a matter, quite frankly, of trying to strike that balance between that New York, let's get things done yesterday mentality, and the realization that it does take a village, but it takes time, So that's also not only the practices, but the philosophy has been integral to what we're doing. Another thing I recently heard, my wife and I had the privilege of attending the National Native Sea Conference that was held in D.C., I believe at the end of March or beginning of April. And there were a couple presentations that I heard about working with tribal nations. And one of the things I heard was the idea that a lot of indigenous people believe they plant for 7 generations ahead. This is completely contrary to how we do agriculture in the United States, right? It's about production in the next quarter. So we've tried to integrate that as well, slowing down what our objectives are, planting for future generations, not just for us. And that perfectly aligns with our goals for ecological restoration as well, right?
Well, I mean, when you talk about agave maturing in 7 to 35 years,
Right.
I mean, that's not something where you're going to make money, in the
Yeah.
foreseeable future.
Right. And I think that's a great point, because when we tell people we're planting agave, many people, since it's pretty hip to drink mezcal these days, they think, oh, we're doing it to create a liquor factory or a distillate of some sort. And I tell them, no, honestly, the very first objective for us is to restore the health of the soil, to introduce drought-resistant crops, to create fields for pollinators so that we can have more biodiversity. We are committed to having 50% of the 300 agave that we recently planted pollinate. In order to make a distillate, when it starts growing the stalk with the blossom, because agave only flowers once in its lifetime. It's the end of its lifetime. It takes 2 months to 2 years for the full pollination. In order to make a distillate, you have to cut the stalk immediately and not allow it to grow, so that the energy goes towards the heart of the plant, which is called the piña, or essentially the pineapple, or the heart of the plant, so that is what's used to create the liquor. So we intend not to cut most of those and to allow them to pollinate, to attract the beautiful moths and butterflies and flies and bees and hummingbirds, and ideally at some point maybe bats to this area, in order to, once again, restore the ecosystem and think about those future generations of what we're doing here.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about when you hear about agave, immediately go to tequila and mezcal, and I had never really thought about the role of agave plants in a healthy ecosystem. What is their place? Like, how do they interact with the soil and everything else? And do they provide habitat, things like that?
Sure. That's a great question. I'm not sure I know the full answer and still learning a lot. What I do know is that agave and other succulents, such as cactus and cholla and opuntia, that's cactus. There's a couple more, or something called desert spoon, actually, is one of the plants that we planted. Desert spoon, also known as Desilerian wheeleri or Desilerian texanum, is another plant that is an up-and-coming source for liquor. It's called Sotol. They have farms and distilleries on the Chihuahuan border in Texas and in Mexico. But what I do know about all these succulents is they work in a way, I think it's called Creslucian acid metabolism, or otherwise known as CAM, so that and I forget the name, their pores essentially open at night in order to take in precipitation or condensation, and they're able to conserve that water, unlike many other plants that may not be able to resist drought conditions, right? So that's the little I know, and there's still a lot more to learn. I've read a lot of scientific papers on it, but it's still a very nascent field of our understanding. That said, we have hundreds of years of knowledge with indigenous or campesino communities that have been doing this, like I said, if not 1,000 years, because you have in the Mayan and Aztec codex pictures of a cactus, and as per our mural, there's actually a goddess of maguey, that's the Mexican word for agave, in Aztec lore. So it's something that's been done for many, many centuries. We may not have distilled the scientific knowledge yet, but a lot is known. Yeah.
So what is your sort of long-term vision? I mean, there's the old joke, how do you make $1 million in farming? You start with $2 million.
Yeah.
And you came from corporate background, and you have, family, off-farm work, and so on. So you don't have the pressures that some farmers have to, make a buck whatever way you can here and now. But still, you kind of need to have a long-term plan, because Otherwise, whatever you saved, you'll sink it into the farm. So what is that plan? Like, is it about selling produce, meat, milk, or other things?
Yeah, so the selling of the goat milk and the market produce, quite frankly, is kind of a side gig based on your joke, which I tell all the time.
Yeah.
Right? You really, when you look at what it takes financially, time-wise, and other resources, farming at the small and mid-level scale is not profitable by any means. You really have to love what you're doing, which we do. And in terms of the long-term strategy, I think, as you mentioned, I have a corporate background. I've been a writer for over 30 years. And I got very lucky that to find that I had a nascent skill at grant writing. So over the last couple of years, we've been very lucky to get about over $100,000 of grants for different projects. So I think in the long-term strategy, we're helping the United States and other farmers understand what regenerative or the prospects of regenerative agriculture are, in particular in the field of succulents and drought-resistant crops. And as your listeners may well know, there's $3 billion allocated towards regenerative agriculture in the next 3 or 4 years by the USDA. Right? Here in the state of New Mexico, the governor also allocated $20 million towards food security and distribution issues. So there is a lot of money to be distributed towards good, well-intentioned projects like we're doing here and all the partners we've been working with. So that's my long-term strategy, quite frankly. It's not going to be with the market. I'm not going to be able to compete with other large farmers, and I think you and I have talked about this, and this happens everywhere, but in particular in New Mexico, 95% of the food produced here is exported out of the state. And then something like 65 to 80% is imported, and a lot of it is processed. So there's a lot to be done here. And luckily we have leaders in government that see that work needs to be done. And so there's money to be taken advantage of.
And so basically it's a kind of grant-funded research and education vision.
Yes, we have 3 operating principles here at Chelenzo Farms, which are education, research, and community. And so our focus is on that primarily. And so everything we can do to fulfill those operating principles, we're doing all we can. Once again, working with the community, taking advantage of grants, building programs, sustainable programs for the long term.
I was thinking about the fact that, you come with a set of skills that most farmers don't have, because you have this kind of marketing and writing skill set, which immediately translates into grant writing. And so money is available to you that in theory is available to other farmers, but in practice, it can't be accessed. And this is a problem that we talked about on this program during the wildfires last year. There's so much money, but how, what is the middleman to get it to the people who need it? You've got those skills, other people don't. How do you see facilitating ways for government money to get to farmers who aren't professional communicators?
Yeah, great question. And it's definitely a problem I'm very cognizant of. And we are looking to help other small farmers and mid-level farmers. And I recently had an experience, or had the privilege to be on a committee that reviewed a number of applications through the New Mexico Economic Development Department. They had launched what they called the Healthy Food Financing Fund. And I was the only farmer rancher on a review committee of 5. And we looked at 60 applications. We were allocating $400,000 to help with food distribution and security concerns. And one of the big issues for me, along with one of my review committee members or fellow members, was the fact that the whole process is very daunting. having applied for many different grants, basically I said, we have to make this a lot easier because we don't have any technical assistance to help these farmers apply. And despite my many years of experience, every time I write an application, it is a lot of work, especially when you get to the federal level. It's exceedingly complicated, and there are many, many forms. And you either have to spend time in the field farming or spend all your time in a little office doing all these applications. So I became very well aware of the process. And so I've worked with the committee and the person who was heading up the initiative, and I've recommended that we build in technical assistance for next rounds of funding. And also through the radio program that I have myself called El Puente on KSWV. It's basically, El Puente is the bridge in Spanish, and we're tying in regenerative agriculture with regenerative health and regenerative community. We're working with other organizations like Quivira, for example, to possibly put in public service messages to help farmers understand that these funds are available to them, and to possibly do some pro bono work with them and helping them fill out these applications. There's definitely a lot of work to be done. I've been very lucky, as I said, to find that I had this latent skill, and I'm going to do my best to help others, in that process.
Tell us about your radio show.
Yeah, so El Puente launched this year on KSWV here. It's based here in Santa Fe on 99.9 FM and 810 AM. Also available on kswvradio.com. So, as
they call it, Que Suave.
Que Suave, right? The radio station was started 32 years ago by George Gonzalez. It is now, who was a former mayor of Santa Fe, and is now run by one of his sons, Esteban Gonzalez. And it's a great radio station that has long served the community in many different ways. And so I was very lucky when we landed here that Esteban asked me to come on and interviewed me about what we were doing here. And eventually we decided, it would be great community service to have a show about regenerative agriculture. And I said, integrated also with that the idea that health, what you eat is what you are, as well as community are all integrated into one another. So we started the show. I've only done 4 compared to your thousands of interviews that you've done. But at some point, I hope that it'll be sustainable enough that we, like you, will help spread the good word about regenerative agriculture and those other areas as well.
Part of the health piece for you, as you said at the beginning of the program, is longevity, and you have a goal to live to be very, very old. Why? Like, what's that all about for you?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm intimately familiar with the concerns of what it means to be very, very old, right? It doesn't get easier, I will share that I was just in California visiting my family. My mother is 78, and it's the very first day she fell. And so we immediately she's okay now, but it was just a poignant example of when you get older, it doesn't get easier. Also, my wife is a physician, and I've heard many, many stories, right? So being that we have these personal examples and that both my wife have focused on understanding longevity, we understand that not only do you want to improve your lifespan, but you want to improve your health span, right? That means growing your own vegetables. It means going to farmers markets. It means understanding what you eat, reading the labels, trying to eat less processed food. So I'm confident, based on what we know and we've practiced over the last few years, that as I get older, I'm hoping to have less of the problems that a lot of people have, and that I will live healthy. And you've mentioned The Blue Zones, which is a fantastic book, and I recommend to everyone, about the study of these 5 communities with the greatest number of centenarians around the world.
Centenarians meaning people who've lived to be over 100,
yeah,
and presumably are in reasonably good health. I mean, is that part of it?
Yes. And in fact, there is a great visual anecdotal example in, all of a sudden I forget his last name, Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan's film In Defense of Food, where he focuses on one of these 5 communities, which is made of Seventh-day Adventists in California, and they show these 90 and 100-year-olds exercising and constantly moving around. And by the way, they're vegetarians, completely vegetarian. So I think there are plenty of examples. This book, as I mentioned, The Blue Zones, in details distills the primary principles by which these people have improved their health and lifespans and are active at 100 years old. So I think it's very possible. But as I've mentioned before, and I cannot say it again, it takes a village. Part of that is that they have strong relationships and strong communities, quite unlike what we have here in the United States, which focuses on independence, which focuses on leaving your family, and striking it out on your own way. You don't have that support network that many traditional old country cultures have. So that's part of our mission here. We've been very lucky enough to, as you said, before we even landed, I was reaching out to everybody, trying, basically tell everybody what our intentions were in terms of agriculture and conservation. And I've built a lot of genuine relationships and friendships here. And so I'm very grateful to the community for embracing us. And it's just been a fantastic journey here.
You've got some kids who are grown and 2 school-aged children whom you moved from the New York City area, sort of the suburbs, to New Mexico. How are they taking to that transition?
Great question. So if you ask them, they'll say, well, I prefer New York.
Really?
But they've only been here 2 years. That said, their experience here is completely different. As I mentioned, we're in the high mountain desert. We contend with and have embraced and really don't find that out, but with the wildlife, we have coyotes every night. We see scorpions, rattlesnakes. There's cactus. Everything in the desert wants to poke you, right? But they both, the younger children, have acclimated and I feel are enjoying their stay here. And I think as a parent, we have to think about the long run and long term consequences of our choices, our life choices. As I mentioned to you before, we landed here, we got rid of the TVs. We have no televisions in our house. We got rid of Netflix. That was very hard to do because we love binge watching. So our children do a lot of reading, as do my wife and I. We play a lot of games together. We spend a lot of time outside. So I think eventually they will acclimate. I think the hardest part for them as young children is the fact they don't have any children or friends nearby. So they only see them during school time or when we've arranged time for them to play with them outside of that. So I think that's the hardest part, but they also have each other. They're 17 months apart. And for the most part, they get along well, apart from the natural inclination for sibling rivalry on occasion.
Anything else that you want to let people know about?
Well, first of all, I've shared that our website is chelenzofarms.com. And that's spelled CHELENZO farms.com. Chelenzo comes from a combination of my first name and my wife's first name, Chelsea and Lorenzo. That's what a lot of our friends called us in New York. We used to also cultivate a lot of community activities and gatherings in Peekskill in New York City when we were there. So we became known as Chelenzo and embraced that. So chelenzofarms.com. I do my best as a writer to share our experiences here, both to create awareness about what we're doing and to encourage others to do the same. And we host workshops at least once a quarter. Ideally, we'll get to the point where we're doing it once a month. So everybody's invited. All our workshops are open to the public. And I would love to hear from you. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or have any ideas for partnerships or collaborations. My email address is lorenzo@chelenzofarms.com.
Lorenzo Dominguez, thank you so much for being with us on Down to Earth.
Thank you. Really appreciate being here.
Save the date for Regenerate 2023. This conference will be held in Santa Fe, New Mexico, November 1st through 3rd. Regenerate 2023 will explore regenerative agriculture at every scale, from microbial soil communities to social relationships and markets, to our changing climate and everything in between. Come learn how people from all walks of life are innovating on the land, in the markets, and with their communities to bring greater diversity and resilience to this movement. Registration will open in June. Check out the website for more information at regenerateconference.com. You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth-planet-to-plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.